June 14, 1944, somewhere in the English countryside near Southampton, beneath grey skies heavy with the promise of rain, Technical Sergeant James Edward Coleman stood in a maintenance depot surrounded by more than 300 Sherman tanks that were, according to every regulation in the United States Army Technical Manual, perfectly safe and ready for deployment to France. The air smelled of oil, fresh paint, and the peculiar metallic tang that comes from new machinery awaiting its baptism in the mud and chaos of war. Around him, mechanics moved with practiced efficiency, making final adjustments to treads, checking fuel lines, ensuring that every bolt was tightened to specification. Nobody suspected that every single one of those armored vehicles contained a flaw so catastrophic that it could turn them into rolling coffins the moment their crews attempted to fire their main guns under combat conditions. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What James Coleman would discover in the next 72 hours would not only save hundreds of American lives, but would also expose a fundamental weakness in the industrial production system that everyone from Detroit factory managers to Pentagon procurement officers had assured the military was flawless. His solution, dismissed by senior officers as a stupid fix that violated proper engineering principles, would become standard procedure across every American armored unit in Europe. Yet his name would appear in no official commendations, no technical bulletins, and no history books for decades to come. James Coleman had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood where the sounds of the steel mills provided a constant backdrop to daily life. His father worked in one of those mills, coming home each evening covered in a fine layer of metallic dust that seemed to have become part of his skin. From the age of 7, James had accompanied his father to work during summer months, initially just sweeping floors and fetching water, but gradually learning the peculiar music of industrial machinery, the subtle changes in pitch that indicated a bearing going bad, the slight hesitation in a motor that suggested misaligned gears. By the time he was 14, he could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone, a skill that impressed even the white foreman who ran the facility, though they would never have admitted it publicly. When war came to America, in December of 1941, James was 23 years old and working as a maintenance technician at a textile mill in Georgia, having left Alabama after a confrontation with local authorities over his refusal to accept substandard pay. He enlisted within weeks of the attack on Pearl Harbor, driven by a complex mixture of patriotism and pragmatic recognition that the military might offer opportunities unavailable to a black man in the civilian South. The recruiting sergeant, a weary-looking man from Ohio who seemed genuinely surprised by James's mechanical aptitude test scores, had promised him training in vehicle maintenance. What the sergeant had not mentioned was that James would spend his first 8 months in the army digging latrines, peeling potatoes, and performing the kind of menial labor that any competent soldier could have done, while his skills went entirely unused. The breakthrough came in North Africa, during the chaos following the battle at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943. The American forces, bloodied and humiliated by their first major encounter with German armor, desperately needed every available mechanic to get damaged vehicles back into operation. James found himself suddenly transferred to a maintenance battalion, working 16-hour days in conditions that would have killed a less determined man. The desert heat was relentless, turning metal surfaces into griddles that could burn flesh in seconds. Sand infiltrated everything, jamming mechanisms, scoring cylinder walls, destroying bearings with an efficiency that seemed almost malicious. Yet James thrived in this environment, developing improvisational repair techniques that earned grudging respect from white mechanics who had initially refused to work alongside him. It was in Tunisia that James first encountered the Sherman tank in large numbers. The M4 Sherman, officially designated medium tank M4, represented American industrial might in its most concentrated form. At 26.3 tons, powered by a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine, producing 350 horsepower, the Sherman could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour on good roads and carried a crew of 5 men. Its main armament, a 75mm gun, could penetrate the armor of most vehicles it encountered, at least in theory. The Americans were producing these tanks at a rate that staggered the imagination. Nearly 50,000 would eventually roll off assembly lines in Detroit, Chicago, and a dozen other industrial centers, a number that dwarfed German production capacity by a factor of more than 10 to 1. But James noticed something that troubled him during those long North African days. Shermans that took hits in combat seemed to burn with a ferocity that other tanks did not. Crews called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company, whose advertising slogan promised that their product lights the first time, every time. German tank crews had their own nickname, Tommy Cooker. James watched recovery crews pull charred bodies from vehicles that had been penetrated by a single shell, the interior transformed into an inferno so intense that it melted metal and fused human remains to steel surfaces. The official explanation was that this was simply the nature of armored warfare, that all tanks were vulnerable, that these losses were acceptable given American numerical superiority. James did not accept this explanation. He began studying every burned-out Sherman he could access, crawling through the blackened interiors when his duties allowed, trying to understand the sequence of events that led from a single penetrating hit to complete immolation. What he discovered was that the ammunition storage, located in sponsons on either side of the hull interior, was inadequately protected. When a shell penetrated the relatively thin side armor of a Sherman, it almost invariably struck these ammunition racks, and the subsequent explosion would fill the crew compartment with fire. The Army knew about this problem. Engineers in Aberdeen Proving Ground had written reports about it. But the production lines were running at full capacity, and any modification would slow output. So the decision had been made to accept the casualties rather than interrupt the manufacturing process. This was the context in which James Coleman found himself standing in that English depot in June of 1944. The invasion of France had begun 10 days earlier, on the 6th of June, and reports from the beachhead indicated that American armor was taking heavy losses. New shipments of Shermans were arriving daily at Southampton, fresh from the factories, their green paint still gleaming, ready to replace the vehicles destroyed in the hedgerow country of Normandy. James had been assigned to a provisional maintenance unit tasked with performing final checks on these tanks before they were loaded onto transport ships. The work was routine, mechanical, the kind of thing that could be done almost without thinking. Check the engine mounts, verify that the transmission shifts smoothly through all gears, test the electrical systems, ensure that the gun traverse mechanism operates without binding. James worked alongside 11 other men, most of them white, in a unit commanded by Captain Raymond Fletcher, a career officer from Pennsylvania who treated his black subordinates with a studied politeness that somehow felt more insulting than open hostility would have been. It was on the second day of his assignment that James noticed something odd about the main gun-firing circuit. He had been checking the electrical system on a Sherman that had just arrived from the factory, tracing wires with practiced efficiency, when he noticed that the insulation on several connections near the gun breech looked different from what he had seen on tanks in North Africa. Newer, perhaps, or made from a different material. He mentioned this to Corporal Michael O'Brien, a mechanic from Boston who had served with James in Tunisia and who had learned to respect his observations. O'Brien examined the connections, shrugged, and said that the factory had probably changed suppliers. James nodded, accepting this explanation, but something about those wires bothered him. The insulation seemed too thin, too brittle. He made a note in his inspection log and moved on to the next vehicle. By the end of that day, James had inspected 17 tanks. On 13 of them, he had noticed the same unusual insulation on the firing circuit wires. That evening, lying in his bunk in the segregated barracks where black soldiers were housed, he found himself unable to sleep, his mind returning again and again to those wires. There was something wrong, he was certain of it, but he could not articulate exactly what the problem was. It was a feeling more than a rational deduction, the kind of mechanical intuition that comes from years of working with machinery, from learning to recognize patterns that exist below the level of conscious thought. The next morning, June 16th, James asked Captain Fletcher for permission to perform a more thorough examination of the firing circuits on several tanks. Fletcher, who had been reviewing a stack of deployment orders, looked up with barely concealed irritation, and asked why such an examination was necessary. James explained his concerns about the insulation, carefully choosing his words to sound deferential rather than alarmant. Fletcher listened with the expression of a man humoring a subordinate who is probably wasting his time, but whose request is too minor to bother denying. He granted permission for James to spend the day examining 5 tanks in detail, but made it clear that this investigation should not interfere with the regular inspection schedule. James selected 5 Shermans at random from the rows of waiting vehicles and began his examination with the methodical precision that characterized all his work. He traced every wire in the firing circuit from the gunner's trigger to the primer in the gun breech, checking connections, measuring voltage drops, testing insulation resistance. What he discovered made his stomach tighten with apprehension. The insulation on the newer wiring was not just thinner than the older type, it was fundamentally inadequate for the application. When he applied the standard voltage test, the insulation began to break down, creating small current leakages that would be negligible in most applications, but potentially catastrophic in a firing circuit. The problem, James realized, was not with the design but with the manufacturing. Some supplier, somewhere in the vast industrial network that fed the American war machine, had cut corners. Perhaps they had used substandard materials to increase profit margins. Perhaps they had simply made an error in specifications that no one had caught. The motivation did not matter. What mattered was that these tanks were leaving the factory with firing circuits that could fail under field conditions. But fail in what way? James sat in the driver's compartment of one of the Shermans, staring at the wiring harness, trying to work through the implications. If the insulation broke down during normal firing, the worst that would happen is a misfire, an inconvenience but hardly a catastrophe. But what if the insulation broke down before firing, creating a short circuit that sent current down an unintended path? What if that stray current reached the ammunition storage? The thought made James's hands suddenly cold, despite the warmth of the June afternoon. Sherman tanks used electrical primers to ignite the main gun propellant. A small electrical charge, carefully controlled and directed, would heat a filament in the primer, which would in turn ignite the propellant charge. But the ammunition racks also contained ready rounds, shells that were stored outside their protective cases for quick loading during combat. These ready rounds had exposed primers. If stray current from a degraded firing circuit reached those primers, they could detonate inside the tank, without any penetrating hit from enemy fire. The crew would have no warning, no chance to escape. One moment they would be preparing to engage a target. The next they would be dead, killed by a flaw in their own equipment. James felt a profound sense of dread as the implications became clear. He needed to verify his theory, but he could not simply test fire a tank in the depot. The noise alone would bring every officer in the area running, and he would have no way to explain what he was doing. Instead, he decided to simulate the conditions of combat firing by creating a test circuit that replicated the voltage and current characteristics of an actual firing sequence, but without igniting any propellant. Working alone in a corner of the depot after the other mechanics had left for dinner, James constructed his test apparatus using spare parts and scavenged components. He connected a section of the questionable wiring to a power source calibrated to match the firing circuit voltage, then subjected the insulation to mechanical stress and temperature cycling to simulate what would happen during extended combat operations. The results confirmed his worst fears. After approximately 2 hours of simulated use, corresponding to perhaps 30 to 40 main gun firings, the insulation began to fail. Small arcs appeared between wires. Current began flowing in unintended directions. James sat in the gathering darkness of the depot, surrounded by tanks that could kill their own crews, and considered his options. He could report his findings to Captain Fletcher, but he knew from experience that white officers rarely took seriously the technical concerns of black enlisted men, particularly when those concerns implied that the massive industrial system behind the war effort had made a fundamental error. He could document everything in a written report, but written reports from sergeants rarely traveled far up the chain of command. He could say nothing and hope that someone else would discover the problem, but he knew that such a discovery would likely come only after men had been killed. The next morning, James approached Captain Fletcher with his findings. He brought his test apparatus, his documentation, and a carefully rehearsed explanation that emphasized facts over speculation. Fletcher listened with increasing impatience, then cut James off mid-sentence to explain that the firing circuits in these tanks had been designed by qualified engineers in Detroit, tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and approved by ordnance specialists with years of experience. The idea that a sergeant with no formal engineering education had discovered a flaw that had escaped the notice of all these experts was, Fletcher said with barely concealed contempt, absurd. James tried to demonstrate his test results, but Fletcher waved him away, stating that he had more important duties than watching parlor tricks with spare parts. James left Fletcher's office feeling a familiar mixture of anger and frustration. He had encountered this attitude before, this reflexive dismissal of anything that challenged established procedures or implied that those in authority might have overlooked something important. In civilian life, he might have simply shrugged and walked away, letting others suffer the consequences of their own arrogance. But these were not abstract statistics. These were men who would be burning alive because of a problem he had identified and that no one would acknowledge. Over the next 2 days, James continued his regular inspection duties, while quietly examining the firing circuits on every tank that passed through his hands. What he found deepened his concern. The problematic wiring was not present in every vehicle, but it appeared in approximately 60% of the tanks manufactured after April of 1944. Some quick mental arithmetic suggested that several thousand Shermans currently in the European theatre, or awaiting deployment, might have this defect. If even a small percentage of these vehicles experienced firing circuit failures under combat conditions, the casualties would be measured in hundreds, possibly thousands. On June 19th, James took his concerns to Lieutenant Marcus Washington, one of the few black officers in the maintenance battalion. Washington listened carefully to James's explanation, examined the test apparatus, and agreed that the problem appeared genuine. However, Washington explained that his own position in the unit was tenuous enough without him making waves by challenging the judgment of senior white officers. He suggested that James write a detailed technical report and submit it through proper channels, letting the system determine whether the concern was valid. James spent most of that night writing his report. He documented his testing procedures, his findings, the theoretical mechanism by which the defect could cause catastrophic failure, and his recommendations for immediate action. He made 3 copies, one for Captain Fletcher, one for the battalion commander, and one for his own records. The next morning, he submitted the first 2 copies through the proper channels and waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. The tanks continued to arrive, continued to pass through their inspections, continued to be loaded onto transport ships bound for France. James watched them go, each one a potential tragedy waiting to unfold, and felt increasingly desperate. On June 22nd, he received a summons to report to Captain Fletcher's office. He arrived to find not only Fletcher, but also Major Robert Cunningham, the battalion executive officer, and a civilian engineer named Mr. Harold Peterson, who had apparently been sent from the Ordnance Department to investigate James's claims. Peterson was a thin man in his 50s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a suit that looked out of place in the military environment. He questioned James closely about his testing procedures, his qualifications, his experience with electrical systems. James answered each question carefully, aware that he was being evaluated not just on his technical knowledge, but on whether a black sergeant without formal engineering training had any business making claims about complicated machinery. After nearly an hour of questions, Peterson announced that he would conduct his own tests, and that James should return to his regular duties. 2 days later, on June 24th, Peterson released his findings. He confirmed that the insulation on the newer wiring was substandard and that it could, under certain conditions, fail in a manner that created short circuits in the firing circuit. However, Peterson stated that the probability of such a failure causing ammunition detonation was very low, probably less than 1%, and that modifying the firing circuits on tanks already in production would cause unacceptable delays in deployment. His recommendation was to continue using the current wiring while initiating a long-term redesign process that would address the issue in future production runs. James read Peterson's report with growing horror. A 1% failure rate might sound acceptable when discussing abstract probabilities, but when applied to the several thousand tanks that had been manufactured with the defective wiring, it meant dozens of crews would experience catastrophic failures. And Peterson's analysis assumed that the failure would only occur under specific conditions. But James's testing suggested that the insulation degraded with use, meaning that the failure rate would increase over time as tanks saw extended combat action. That evening, James sat in the segregated mess hall, pushing food around his plate without eating, trying to decide what to do next. The official channels had failed. The experts had acknowledged the problem but deemed it acceptable. The tanks would continue to deploy, and men would continue to die. He thought about his father, who had spent 30 years in the steel mills accepting unacceptable working conditions because challenging them would have meant losing his job and possibly his life. He thought about all the times he had been told that his place was to follow orders, not to question decisions made by those above him. He thought about the peculiar mathematics of military service, where a black man was expected to risk his life for a country that treated him as a second-class citizen, yet was not trusted to have valid concerns about the equipment on which lives depended. Corporal O'Brien sat down across from James, noticed his mood and asked what was wrong. James explained the situation, his voice low to avoid being overheard by the white soldiers at nearby tables. O'Brien listened, then offered a suggestion that was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. Why not simply fix the problem directly, without waiting for official approval? The firing circuits were not complex. If James could identify a modification that would prevent the short-circuit failures, they could implement it themselves on the tanks passing through their depot. It would violate regulations. It would be technically unauthorized, but if it worked, if it saved lives, then surely any court-martial would take that into account. James considered this proposal from every angle. The risks were substantial. If his modification failed, if it caused problems worse than the original defect, he would be responsible not just for violating regulations, but for potentially getting soldiers killed. If his modification worked, but was discovered before the tanks saw combat, he could face serious disciplinary action for unauthorized modifications to military equipment. But if he did nothing, he knew with absolute certainty that men would die from a problem he could have prevented. The next morning, June 25th, James began working on a solution. The fundamental problem was that the degraded insulation allowed current to leak from the firing circuit to the tank's chassis, and from there potentially to any grounded conductor, including the ammunition racks. The solution in principle was simple: add additional insulation and fusing to prevent any stray current from reaching unintended destinations, but implementing this solution in a way that was reliable, that would not interfere with normal firing operations, and that could be done quickly without obvious visible modifications, required considerable ingenuity. James spent hours examining the firing circuit layout, tracing current paths, identifying potential failure modes. The solution he developed was elegantly simple. He would add a secondary insulating sleeve over the existing wiring, using a material that was readily available in the depot supplies, and he would install a small fuse in the circuit between the firing trigger and the primer, calibrated so that it would blow instantly if any abnormal current flow occurred, but would pass normal firing current without interruption. The entire modification could be completed in less than 30 minutes per tank, and would be almost invisible unless someone specifically looked for it. O'Brien agreed to help, and the two of them began implementing the modification on tanks awaiting final inspection. They worked during lunch breaks, during the brief periods when supervisors were occupied elsewhere, whenever they could find a few minutes unsupervised. They said nothing to the other mechanics, knowing that loose talk could end their effort before it properly began. Each modified tank received a small chalk mark on its interior, visible only to someone inside the crew compartment, so that James could track which vehicles had received the fix. By June 30th, they had modified 43 tanks. It was exhausting work, physically and mentally draining, carried out under constant fear of discovery. Several times they nearly got caught, having to quickly return to authorized maintenance tasks when officers appeared unexpectedly. But they persisted, driven by the knowledge that every tank they modified was one less potential death trap. On July 1st, Captain Fletcher conducted a surprise inspection of the depot, a routine procedure meant to ensure that all work was being performed to specifications. He examined several tanks at random, checking various systems against his clipboard of requirements. By terrible coincidence, or perhaps by some instinct that drew him to anomalies, he selected one of the modified tanks for detailed examination. James watched from across the depot as Fletcher opened the access panel to the firing circuit, saw his expression change as he noticed the additional insulation and the unauthorized fuse. Fletcher summoned James immediately. His face was flushed with anger as he demanded to know who had made unauthorized modifications to military equipment. James considered lying, considered claiming ignorance, but decided that such evasion would only make things worse. He admitted that he had made the modifications, explained why, and showed Fletcher the technical justification for each element of the fix. Fletcher listened with an expression that suggested he was watching someone dig their own grave with tremendous efficiency. When James finished his explanation, Fletcher was silent for a long moment. Then he asked in a voice tight with suppressed rage how many tanks James had modified in this manner. James told him 43. Fletcher's face went from red to nearly purple. He informed James that he was confining him to barracks pending a court-martial for destruction of government property, for unauthorized modification of military equipment, and for insubordination. He ordered O'Brien to remove all of the unauthorized modifications immediately and to document every tank that had been altered so that they could be returned to proper specifications. James was escorted to his barracks by 2 military police officers and ordered to remain there until further notice. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had just destroyed his military career and possibly his post-war future over a fix that would now never be implemented. The irony was bitter. He had risked everything to save lives, and the result would be that the dangerous wiring would remain in place while he faced punishment for trying to correct it. But fate, or perhaps simple military bureaucracy, intervened. The same day that James was confined to barracks, a Sherman tank from the 2nd Armored Division experienced a catastrophic internal explosion near Saint-Lô in France. The tank was not hit by enemy fire. It was not struck by a mine. It simply exploded while its crew was preparing to fire at a German position, killing all 5 men instantly. The tank commander, First Lieutenant David Sullivan from Oregon, had kept a detailed log of all mechanical issues with his vehicle. That log, recovered from the wreckage, noted that the main gun firing circuit had been experiencing intermittent electrical problems for the previous 3 days, including several misfires and what Sullivan described as unusual sparking near the breech. This incident, combined with 2 similar explosions in other units during the same week, finally prompted a more serious investigation. A team of ordnance specialists was dispatched from the United States to examine firing circuits on Shermans, both in the field and in depot storage. What they discovered confirmed everything James had been trying to communicate. The newer wiring insulation was breaking down under field conditions at a much higher rate than Peterson's original assessment had suggested, and this breakdown was creating exactly the kind of short-circuit failures that James had predicted. On July 8th, a full week after James's confinement, Major Cunningham visited him in the barracks. Cunningham looked uncomfortable, a man forced to deliver news that contradicted his previously held assumptions. He informed James that the ordnance investigation had validated his concerns and that the Army was now scrambling to implement a fix across all affected vehicles. Then, with obvious reluctance, Cunningham acknowledged that James's unauthorized modification appeared to be functionally identical to the solution that the ordnance engineers were now recommending as standard procedure. In fact, after examining one of the tanks James had modified, the lead engineer from the investigating team had stated that the fix was about as elegant a field solution as he had ever seen, addressing the problem with minimal parts and maximum reliability. Cunningham stated that the court-martial proceedings would be dropped, that James would return to duty immediately, and that his modification would become the template for repairs across the European theatre. He did not apologize for the week of confinement. He did not acknowledge that James had been right and that the officers had been wrong. He simply laid out the facts in the clipped, emotionless tone of a man reading from an official script, then left before James could respond. Over the next 3 weeks, James found himself in the peculiar position of training other mechanics to implement the fix he had developed, working 18-hour days to modify every Sherman that passed through Southampton. The Army established a formal technical bulletin designated TB-ORD 437 that described the modification procedure in detail. The bulletin made no mention of James Coleman. It credited the fix to the Ordnance Engineering team from Aberdeen Proving Ground, who had, the bulletin stated, developed the solution in response to field reports of firing circuit anomalies. Corporal O'Brien, who witnessed this systematic erasure of James's contribution, expressed his outrage in terms that were colourful and entirely unprintable. But James simply shrugged and continued working. He had learned long ago that recognition was not something a black man in America could expect, in the military or anywhere else. What mattered was that the fix was being implemented, that crews would not burn alive because of a solvable problem, that he had made a difference even if no one would ever acknowledge it publicly. By the end of July 1944, more than 2,000 Sherman tanks had been modified using James's procedure. Field reports indicated that the modification was performing exactly as intended, preventing short-circuit failures without interfering with normal firing operations. Several tank commanders submitted commendations praising the improved reliability of their firing circuits, unaware that the fix had been designed by a black sergeant whose name they would never know. The human impact of James's work became clear through scattered reports that filtered back from the front lines. A tank crew from the 4th Armored Division reported that their firing circuit had experienced a failure during an engagement near Coutances, but instead of a catastrophic explosion, they had experienced only a blown fuse that took 90 seconds to replace, allowing them to continue fighting and ultimately survive the encounter. A maintenance officer from the 3rd Armored Division noted in his after-action report that tanks with the modified firing circuits showed significantly lower rates of internal fires compared to unmodified vehicles, though he attributed this to improved crew training rather than to any technical modification. James continued his work through the summer and fall of 1944 as American forces broke out of the Normandy hedgerows, liberated Paris, and pushed toward the German border. He was eventually promoted to technical sergeant, a rank that came with slightly better pay, but no additional respect from the white officers who supervised his work. He trained newly arrived mechanics, solved problems that others could not diagnose, and quietly ensured that the tanks leaving his depot were as safe and reliable as he could make them. In December of 1944, during the desperate fighting in the Ardennes forest that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, American tank crews found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by German armor that had achieved complete surprise. The battles were brutal, fought in snow and freezing temperatures, with American Shermans going up against German Panthers and Tigers in terrain that favored the defender. American losses were heavy, with entire units being overrun in the initial assault. But the tanks held, their crews fought, and ultimately the German offensive was stopped and then reversed. A statistical analysis conducted after the battle showed something interesting. The rate of catastrophic internal fires in Sherman tanks during the Ardennes fighting was significantly lower than it had been in Normandy earlier that year. Some analysts attributed this to improved armor on newer production tanks. Others suggested that crews had become more skilled at ammunition management, but a few perceptive officers noted that the most significant variable was the presence or absence of the firing circuit modification documented in TB-ORD 437. Tanks with the modification experienced internal fires at roughly one-third the rate of unmodified vehicles, even accounting for differences in armor thickness and crew experience. No one connected this statistical anomaly to a black sergeant in a maintenance depot in England, because no one in the analysis section knew that such a connection existed. James Coleman served through the end of the war in Europe, continuing his maintenance work as American forces crossed the Rhine, encircled the Ruhr and pushed deep into Germany. He was present at a depot near Frankfurt when news came of the German unconditional surrender in May of 1945. He celebrated with his unit, shared drinks with men who had learned to respect his skills, if not his skin color, and wondered what would come next. After the war, James was discharged with an honorable service record that made no mention of his most significant contribution. He returned to Alabama, found work as a mechanic in a segregated garage that served black customers, and married a schoolteacher named Dorothy Williams, who taught in the colored school system. They raised 3 children, bought a small house, and lived a life that appeared from the outside entirely unremarkable. But James never forgot the summer of 1944, and he never stopped thinking about the tanks he had modified, the crews who had survived because of a fix that everyone had initially dismissed as stupid. He kept his copy of TBORD 437, the one with the modifications described, but with no mention of their origin, filed away in a footlocker in his attic. Sometimes, usually late at night when he could not sleep, he would take out that bulletin and read through it, remembering. In 1968, a historian researching American tank operations during World War II came across an unusual discrepancy in the official records. Technical Bulletin ORD 437 was dated July 15, 1944, but references to a firing circuit modification matching its description appeared in maintenance logs from late June, several weeks before the bulletin was officially issued. Intrigued, the historian began tracing the origins of the modification, following a trail through depot records, inspection logs, and personal correspondence. This investigation eventually led to Southampton, to the records of the depot where James had worked, and to a notation in Captain Fletcher's log about an unauthorized modification discovered on July 1st. The historian tracked down Fletcher, by then retired and living in Pennsylvania, and asked him about the incident. Fletcher, elderly and perhaps mellowed by time, admitted that he had initially been furious about the unauthorized work, but had later come to realize that the black sergeant had been absolutely correct in his technical judgment. He provided James Coleman's name and last known address. The historian contacted James in 1970, 26 years after the events at Southampton. James, by then 62 years old and still working as a mechanic, was reluctant to discuss his wartime service. He had learned not to draw attention to himself, not to make waves, not to claim credit for things that the official record attributed to others. But the historian persisted, and eventually James agreed to an interview. Over the course of several long conversations, James described his discovery of the wiring problem, his attempts to work through official channels, his decision to implement an unauthorized fix, and the subsequent validation of his work. He spoke without bitterness about the lack of recognition, without anger about the systematic erasure of his contribution from the official record. He stated simply that he had done what needed to be done, that men's lives had been at stake, and that the recognition or lack thereof was less important than the outcome. The historian published his findings in a specialized military history journal in 1972. The article, titled Unauthorized Innovation, a case study in field modification of combat equipment, documented James Coleman's contribution to American armor operations in World War II and argued that his work had potentially saved hundreds of lives. The article was read by perhaps a few hundred specialists and made no impact whatsoever on popular understanding of the war. But the article did reach Major General Lawrence Henderson, who had commanded a tank battalion in Europe and who remembered the firing circuit problems from personal experience. Henderson, moved by the story and ashamed that he had never known the origin of the fix that had protected his crews, began a personal campaign to secure official recognition for James Coleman's service. He contacted the Army's Awards and Decorations Board, wrote letters to congressional representatives, and generally made himself a nuisance to anyone who would listen. In 1975, the Army quietly issued a commendation to James Coleman, acknowledging his technical innovation and his contribution to vehicle safety during World War II. The commendation arrived in the mail, a single sheet of paper with official seals and signatures, 31 years after the events it described. James read it once, showed it to Dorothy, then filed it away with his copy of TBORD 437. He never framed it, never displayed it, never mentioned it to anyone outside his immediate family. When asked years later why he had not made more of the recognition, why he had not sought publicity, or used it as a platform to discuss the broader issues of race and recognition in the military, James simply said that the commendation was never the point. The point was that he had seen a problem, had understood how to fix it, and had taken action when no one else would. The recognition, such as it was, came from knowing that he had done the right thing at the right time, regardless of the personal cost or the lack of official acknowledgement. James Coleman passed away in 1998 at the age of 80. His obituary in the local Birmingham newspaper mentioned his military service in a single sentence, noting that he had served in a maintenance battalion during World War II. There was no mention of firing circuits, of unauthorized modifications, or of the hundreds of men whose lives he had saved through his stubborn refusal to accept that a solvable problem should remain unsolved. But among the papers in his footlocker, found by his children after his death, was a letter from a veteran named Robert Martinez, who had commanded a Sherman during the fighting in France. Martinez had somehow learned of James's role in developing the firing circuit modification and had written to thank him. The letter, dated 1976, described an incident near Metz in which Martinez's tank had experienced a firing circuit failure during combat. Instead of exploding, the tank had simply stopped firing, allowing the crew to retreat to safety and repair the fuse. Martinez stated that he owed his life to a fix that he had not even known existed until reading about it decades later, and he wanted James to know that his work had mattered, that it had made a difference, that he was remembered by at least some of the men he had saved. The broader implications of James Coleman's story extend far beyond the technical details of firing circuits and insulation failures. His experience illuminated fundamental tensions in how large organizations, military or civilian, process information from those at the bottom of hierarchical structures. James possessed specific technical knowledge based on direct observation and hands-on experience, yet this knowledge was systematically dismissed by those higher in the chain of command who lacked his expertise but who held institutional authority. This pattern, repeated countless times throughout military history, represents an enormous waste of human potential and practical wisdom. The racial dimension of James's experience cannot be separated from its technical aspects. A white officer with James's qualifications would likely have been commissioned, would have held formal engineering credentials, would have been listened to when he raised concerns about equipment safety. James, despite demonstrable technical brilliance that exceeded that of most formally trained engineers, was confined to enlisted ranks and had his expertise routinely questioned. The fact that he was ultimately proven correct did not fundamentally alter these dynamics. It simply created a momentary exception that allowed his contribution to be grudgingly acknowledged while the underlying system remained unchanged. The industrial context of James's discovery is equally revealing. The American war production system, celebrated for its unprecedented output and efficiency, had created a quality control failure that could have killed thousands of men. The defective wiring was not the result of malicious intent, but rather of the inevitable problems that occur when production is scaled up at tremendous speed. Some supplier, somewhere in the vast network of subcontractors and manufacturers, had cut corners or made an error, and that error had propagated through the system because quality control inspections were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of production. The system was designed to catch major defects, obvious problems that would cause immediate failure. It was not designed to catch subtle issues that would only manifest after extended use under combat conditions. James's solution, dismissed initially as a stupid fuse fix, represented exactly the kind of field innovation that military organizations claim to value but often resist in practice. Military culture emphasizes following established procedures, adhering to regulations, maintaining standardization across units. These principles are necessary and important, but they can also create institutional rigidity that prevents rapid response to emerging problems. James violated regulations when he implemented his unauthorized modification, but in doing so, he saved lives that would have been lost if he had waited for the system to correct itself through proper channels. The statistical impact of James's work can be roughly estimated from available data. Approximately 3,000 Sherman tanks were manufactured with the defective wiring between April and July of 1944. If Peterson's original estimate of a 1% failure rate under combat conditions was accurate, this would suggest 30 catastrophic internal explosions. But field data from Normandy suggests that the actual failure rate was higher, perhaps 3 to 5%, which would indicate 90 to 150 potential incidents. Sherman crews consisted of 5 men, so the total potential casualties would have been between 450 and 750 soldiers. Not all of these men would have died. Some crews would have escaped burning vehicles, though typically with severe injuries. But a conservative estimate suggests that James's modification prevented at least 200 to 300 deaths and perhaps an equal number of serious injuries. These numbers, dry and abstract, represent individual human beings who went on to live full lives because a black sergeant in a maintenance depot decided that regulations were less important than preventing preventable deaths. They represent children who were born, marriages that occurred, careers that flourished, all made possible by a fix that took 30 minutes to implement and that used parts worth less than $5 per tank. The question of why James's contribution was systematically erased from the official record has no simple answer. Part of the explanation lies in the general bureaucratic tendency to credit formal organizations rather than individuals, to attribute success to proper procedures rather than to personal initiative. But part of the explanation is undoubtedly racial. The military of 1944 was a deeply segregated institution that reflected the broader racial attitudes of American society. The idea that a black enlisted man had solved a problem that white officers and engineers had dismissed or overlooked challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, expertise, and authority. It was simpler, more comfortable, to attribute the fix to the ordnance engineering team, to maintain the fiction that the solution had emerged through proper channels from appropriately credentialed experts. This erasure was not necessarily malicious or even conscious. No one sat down and decided to deliberately remove James's name from the historical record. Rather, the system simply processed information in a way that confirmed existing assumptions and hierarchies. The fix became associated with the formal bulletin that documented it, and the bulletin was issued by the Ordnance Department, so the Ordnance Department received credit. James's role was noted in scattered documents, in maintenance logs and inspection reports, but these documents were archived and forgotten, never compiled into a coherent narrative that would preserve his contribution for history. The story of James Coleman raises uncomfortable questions about how many other contributions from marginalized individuals have been similarly erased. How much innovation and insight has been lost because the people who generated it lacked the social standing or formal credentials to have their ideas taken seriously. The military context makes these questions particularly acute because military organizations keep extensive records, document procedures in detail, maintain clear chains of command and responsibility. If systematic erasure can occur in such a well-documented environment, how much more prevalent must it be in less structured contexts? Yet the story also demonstrates the limits of institutional control over individual action. James made a choice to implement his fix despite explicit orders to the contrary, despite the risk of court-martial, despite the certainty that he would receive no recognition for his work. He made this choice because he believed it was the right thing to do, because he valued the lives of men he would never meet over his own career security. This kind of moral courage, this willingness to act on principle despite personal cost, is rare enough that it deserves recognition whenever it occurs, regardless of the race or rank of the person demonstrating it. The technical elegance of James's solution is worth noting in its own right. The modification was simple, using readily available materials, requiring no specialized tools or skills to implement. It was robust, functioning reliably under extreme conditions without requiring maintenance or adjustment. It was foolproof, adding a fail-safe mechanism that would prevent catastrophic failure even if other safety systems failed. These characteristics, the hallmarks of good engineering design, emerged not from formal education, but from practical experience, from a deep intuitive understanding of how mechanical and electrical systems behave under stress. This point deserves emphasis because it challenges common assumptions about the relationship between formal education and practical competence. James Coleman had no engineering degree, had never taken a university course in electrical theory or mechanical design. What he had was decades of hands-on experience working with machinery, an observant mind that noticed subtle anomalies, and the intellectual humility to recognize that his concerns might be wrong but deserved serious investigation. These qualities, more than any formal credential, enabled him to identify and solve a problem that threatened thousands of lives. The broader military context of James's work also merits reflection. The summer of 1944 represented a critical moment in the European war. American forces had successfully landed in Normandy, but faced brutal fighting in the hedgerow country, where German defenders held every advantage of terrain and where every field and farmhouse could conceal enemy troops or armor. The Shermans, for all their mechanical reliability and numerical superiority, were vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons and were outgunned by heavier German tanks. American tank crews needed every advantage they could get, every edge that might improve their chances of survival. James's modification provided such an edge, reducing one source of vulnerability, allowing crews to focus on fighting the enemy rather than worrying about their own equipment. The human cost of the hedgerow fighting was staggering. American casualties in Normandy during June and July of 1944 exceeded expectations, with some units experiencing casualty rates that approached those of World War I trench warfare. Tank crews were particularly vulnerable, operating in terrain where short-range ambushes were common and where escape from a disabled vehicle was often impossible. Every tank that did not explode from internal failure, every crew that survived to fight another day, represented a small victory in a campaign where small victories were the only kind available. James understood this context, understood that the tanks he was working on would soon be carrying men into combat, where they would face terrible dangers. He understood that some of those men would die regardless of what he did, that no amount of maintenance could make them invulnerable to German 88mm guns or Panzerfaust rockets. But he also understood that dying because of defective equipment was fundamentally different from dying in combat, that men deserved weapons they could trust, that technical problems should not add to the already overwhelming dangers they faced. This understanding drove his decision to implement the unauthorized modification to risk his own career in order to give those crews one less thing to worry about. It was not a grand gesture, not a dramatic act of heroism that would be celebrated in newspapers or commemorated in monuments. It was simply a mechanic doing his job the way it should be done, refusing to accept unnecessary risk to those who depended on his work. The aftermath of James's story, the gradual recognition that came decades after the events, reflects a broader pattern in how societies process and acknowledge contributions from marginalized groups. Initial erasure or dismissal is followed, often many years later, by rediscovery and partial recognition. This delayed acknowledgement is better than nothing, but it also reveals the limitations of historical memory and the persistence of institutional biases. James Coleman did not need recognition in 1975, 31 years after his work in Southampton. He needed it in 1944, when such recognition might have led to his advancement, might have inspired other black soldiers to speak up about problems they observed, might have begun to break down the racial barriers that limited who could contribute to the war effort. The formal commendation James received in 1975 was a token, a symbolic acknowledgement that cost the Army nothing and that did nothing to address the broader issues his experience had revealed. It did not lead to any systematic examination of how many other contributions from black soldiers had been similarly overlooked. It did not prompt reforms in how the military evaluates innovations from enlisted personnel. It was simply a way of closing the books on an embarrassing episode, of acknowledging a debt without committing to any meaningful change. Yet even this limited recognition mattered to some of the men whose lives James had saved. The letter from Robert Martinez, found among James's papers after his death, demonstrated that at least some veterans understood what had been done for them and felt genuine gratitude toward a man they had never met. Martinez's letter suggests that there may have been other tank commanders or crew members who survived because of a modification they did not even know existed, who went on to live full lives without ever knowing to whom they owed thanks. This disconnect between action and recognition between consequence and acknowledgement, is perhaps the most poignant aspect of James Coleman's story. He made a difference in the most fundamental way possible, by saving lives that would otherwise have been lost. Yet he did so in obscurity, receiving no recognition from most of those he helped, no fame, no public honor. His satisfaction had to come from internal sources, from the knowledge that he had acted rightly regardless of recognition, that the work itself was worthwhile regardless of who received credit. In this sense, James Coleman embodied a particular kind of moral integrity that deserves recognition, even if it is rarely achieved. He did the right thing not because he expected reward, but because it needed to be done. He persisted in the face of dismissal and obstruction, not because he was seeking glory, but because he understood that the stakes were too high to let institutional inertia prevent necessary action. He accepted the erasure of his contribution without bitterness, because the contribution itself mattered more than the recognition. These qualities, moral courage and intellectual integrity and personal humility, are not specific to any race or era. They represent human virtues that transcend particular contexts. But James's story demonstrates how these virtues can flourish even in environments that are actively hostile to their expression, how individuals can maintain their principles even when institutions fail to support or acknowledge them. His example suggests that the capacity for moral action is not dependent on formal authority or social position, that ordinary people in apparently powerless positions can still make choices that matter enormously. The technical legacy of James's work extended well beyond World War II. The principle he demonstrated, that firing circuits in armored vehicles needed robust protection against short circuits, became standard practice in post-war tank design. Modern armored vehicles incorporate multiple levels of electrical isolation and fusing, ensuring that stray currents cannot reach ammunition or fuel. These safety features are taken for granted now, considered basic elements of proper design, but their origins can be traced in part to a fix developed by a black sergeant in an English depot in the summer of 1944. The story of James Coleman also serves as a reminder that technological systems, no matter how sophisticated or carefully designed, remain vulnerable to subtle failures that only become apparent under operational conditions. The Sherman firing circuit problem was not caught during factory testing, because factory testing could not replicate the cumulative stress of extended combat operations. It was not caught during acceptance inspections, because those inspections focused on verifying that systems worked at all, not on how they would degrade over time. It took someone with James's specific combination of skills and experience, someone who understood both electrical systems and mechanical stress, to recognize the problem and develop an effective solution. This points to a broader truth about innovation and problem-solving in complex systems. Formal expertise and rigorous testing are necessary but not sufficient. Real-world conditions always contain factors that laboratory testing cannot anticipate. The people who operate and maintain equipment in the field often develop insights that designers and engineers working in more controlled environments cannot match. Organizations that fail to tap this field-level expertise, that dismiss concerns from operators and maintainers, inevitably miss problems that could be caught early and solved at relatively low cost. The military has learned this lesson many times over its history, yet continues to struggle with implementing effective mechanisms for capturing field-level innovation and expertise. Part of the problem is cultural. Military hierarchies emphasize top-down authority and standardized procedures, both of which can suppress individual initiative. Part of the problem is practical. The military operates at such enormous scale that centralizing all technical decisions would be impossible. Yet decentralizing decision-making risks inconsistency and loss of control. Finding the right balance between standardization and flexibility, between following procedures and adapting to circumstances, remains an ongoing challenge. James Coleman's approach to this challenge was pragmatic rather than theoretical. He worked within the system when he could, submitting reports through proper channels, attempting to convince superiors through logical argument and demonstration. When the system failed to respond appropriately, when regulations and procedures became obstacles to necessary action, he worked around them, implementing his solution without authorization and accepting the personal risk that such action entailed. His approach was not rebellious or dismissive of authority. It was simply practical, focused on solving an urgent problem through whatever means were available. This pragmatism, this focus on outcomes rather than procedures, represents a different kind of professionalism from that typically celebrated in military culture. Military professionalism usually emphasizes discipline, adherence to regulations, respect for chain of command. James demonstrated these qualities, but he also demonstrated the wisdom to recognize when following regulations would produce unacceptable outcomes, and the courage to act on that recognition despite knowing that he would likely face punishment for doing so. The fact that his approach ultimately succeeded, that his unauthorized modification was eventually adopted as standard procedure, should not obscure the reality that things could easily have gone differently. If the ordnance investigation had not confirmed his findings, if the field failures had not occurred when they did, if any of a dozen contingent factors had been different, James might have faced court-martial and dishonorable discharge for destroying government property. He took that risk knowingly, calculated that the potential benefit outweighed the personal cost, and acted accordingly. The fact that it worked out, that he was vindicated rather than punished, was partly a matter of luck. This element of contingency, of chance factors determining whether courageous action is rewarded or punished, raises troubling questions about how we evaluate ethical behavior. If we celebrate James Coleman for his unauthorized modification because it ultimately saved lives, are we implicitly suggesting that unauthorized action is acceptable as long as it works out? What about someone who takes similar risks but is wrong, whose unauthorized modification causes problems rather than solving them? Should we judge ethical behavior by its outcomes or by the reasoning and intentions that motivated it? These questions have no easy answers, but James's story suggests at least one principle. When institutional procedures prevent necessary action to protect human life, individuals may have a moral obligation to circumvent those procedures, accepting whatever personal cost such circumvention entails. This principle is dangerous if applied carelessly, if everyone who disagrees with a regulation decides they are justified in ignoring it. But in cases where the stakes are clear, where delay will certainly result in preventable deaths, where proper channels have been tried and have failed, principled civil disobedience may be the only ethical choice. The comparison to civil disobedience in the civilian context is instructive. Civil rights activists who violated segregation laws in the 1950s and 60s made essentially the same argument that James made with his unauthorized modification, that unjust or inadequate laws could not be allowed to prevent necessary action, that individuals had both the right and the duty to act on their principles, even when those actions violated formal rules. The difference was mainly one of visibility. Civil rights activists deliberately made their violations public, accepting punishment in order to draw attention to unjust laws. James operated in obscurity, hoping to avoid detection until his modifications had saved enough lives that punishing him would be politically untenable. Both approaches required courage, though of different kinds. Civil rights activists faced physical danger and social ostracism for their public acts of resistance. James faced the quiet destruction of his career and future prospects, the grinding punishment of military discipline imposed far from public view. Neither form of courage is more admirable than the other. They simply represent different responses to similar moral imperatives. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.